Hello, good morning. Welcome to the Space Diplomacy panel. We are going to listen to Sandeep Abad and William Stewart. I now pass the floor to Sandeep Abad. He's professor of law from the WB National University of Juridical Sciences in Kolkata. And go ahead. We are looking forward to listening to you.
Thank you. I'll just take a minute to share the screen. Hope it's visible now. Yes. Right. I should say a very warm good evening to all of you from India. It's quite late in the evening here, so good evening to all of you. Let me also thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to speak in this particular prestigious event. I'll be speaking on something about the 20th century space law or the treaties which have been entered in the 20th century, and how exactly maybe in the modern period of time there are multiple questions which have been raised about the implementation of those treaties, taking the gateway as an example. So I'll be speaking on evaluating the human gateway to celestial bodies from the UN space treaties perspective. Now, as all of us are aware of, we have moved quite away from the scientific activities to the commercial uses over the period of the time. 20th century predominantly has been actually the century of the scientific uses of the outer space, but now we find actually more and more commercial uses of the outer space for various applications, maybe including telecommunication, direct television broadcasting, telemedicine, teleeducation, or maybe meteorology, remote sensing, so on and so forth. Gateway has a very significant role to play, maybe in terms of boosting further the commercial activities in the celestial bodies. I think there is no requirement of actually explaining the audience with respect to the gateway, since there has been discussion yesterday as well as maybe in today's early session as well. So let me not actually delve into the gateway and the plans in terms of that. Let me highlight one thing, because that is relevant in terms of my legal arguments at a later point in time. That is, unlike the earlier model of maybe the space stations, whether it is actually Skylab or maybe International Space Station or the Changi station which we are having, Gateway is a public-private partnership model. It's a PPP model, and others are all actually the public-funded the projects. Here it is with the involvement of the SpaceX and then also the possible involvement of other private companies. This is one of the unique models since it's a public-private partnership. This is definitely going to be something which has a tremendous commercial implications, because it's going to be a stop for reaching the moon quite often by the human beings or maybe to the other celestial bodies. So we are going to have the long-term presence in the celestial bodies with the help of the gateway. So long-term presence would definitely carry more commercial implications, and maybe in light of that, actually, we have to consider the legal aspects, especially the 20th century treaties, which we have already entered into, and we have the commitments under them. To start with, the space treaties, 5 space treaties we are having: Outer Space Treaty 1967, the Rescue Agreement 1968, a Liability Convention 1972, Registration Convention 1975, and the Moon Agreement of 1979. They were entered on the strong foundations of the common rights philosophy. Maybe the understanding of the drafters at that time has been that the outer space and celestial bodies are the bounty of nature. So when it is recognized as a bounty of the nature, there is a requirement of respecting the rights of everyone in the outer space and the celestial bodies, has been the logic behind incorporation of the common rights principles. If we look into the Outer Space Treaty, which is the so-called Magna Carta of the space law, and almost all the spacefaring nations are the parties to it. We can find that the common rights principle has been very, very strongly rooted there. Starting with Article 1 itself, if you look into Article 1, it categorically says that the exploration and use of the outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, should be the benefit and interest of all countries. Irrespective of the economic development, it should be for the benefit and interest of all countries. And it also goes on to say that it is the province of all mankind. So these principles clearly reflect that the common rights regime has been imbibed under Article 1 itself. And the same provision also goes on to speak about the freedom of exploration, use, and scientific investigation. Every country, irrespective of any kind of economic development, they have got the freedom of exploration, use, and scientific investigation. And added to that, everyone has got the free access to the all parts of celestial bodies. Article 1 itself is very clear in terms of that. And when somebody is actually carrying on activities in outer space or celestial bodies, they should also take care of the fact that others' access is not going to be prevented, right? Since one is mentioning about the free access for everyone to all parts of the celestial bodies. This is further supplemented by Article 2, which, if you look into it, basically says about the principle of national non-appropriation. It categorically says that outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, is not subject to the national appropriation by claim of sovereignty, by use or occupation, or by any other means. So that's how it tries to supplement the common rights principle by showing as if an individual appropriation or a one country going and appropriating the resources or maybe the outer space resources is not something in a way permissible. So that's reflected under Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty. Of course, the Moon Agreement 1979 tried to carry forward this logic, and it also wanted to incorporate the concept of the common heritage of mankind. If we look into Article 11 of the Moon Agreement, it speaks about the common heritage of mankind, but has not been very successful since only very limited number of states have ratified the Moon Agreement. Only 18, and that too Saudi Arabia has deposited a declaration for the withdrawal. So we would be having only 17 states ratifying the Moon Agreement. That too, majority of them are not even spacefaring nations, right? So that's why the practical implementation of the common heritage of mankind is certainly debatable. Whatever it may be, Outer Space Treaty, which is still agreed now and has been ratified by almost all the countries in the world, has got sufficient seats of the common rights regime. Even the province of all mankind, access to all the parts, carrying on the activities for the benefit and interest of everyone, it all reflect clearly that the common rights regime is something actually which has been advocated under the Outer Space Treaty. Now, in this context, if we look into the Project Gateway, few questions crop up. One of them is about the mining. Is this going to be a mining gateway, especially in the wake of the Artemis program, which is already being kick-started? So, is it going to be a mining the gateway? In that context, what comes very relevant is the principle of non-appropriation, which I just highlighted, Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty. There are two interpretations, which I should say in a way is a misinterpretation of Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty. One, arguing that what Article 2 prohibits is only the national appropriation, because the wordings are like national non-appropriation. There should not be any appropriation by the, argument may be that only by the states, not by the private players. This is something not definitely acceptable. And logically also it doesn't make any sense, because when you prohibit the state to appropriate the celestial bodies, allowing the private players to go for appropriation doesn't make any sense. And more than that, if you look into the scholarly writings, it is very clear that there was no specific mention about prohibition on individual appropriation, because under both common law system and the civil law system, it is not possible for an individual to go for appropriation of celestial resources directly. Under the common law system, if we look into all the land property belongs to the state. That's why we have the principle of eminent domain. So everything is the charity of the state. What we enjoy as actually our land is the charity of the state. So unless and until actually state is granting us the rights, there is no possibility of an individual from the common law system to claim the property rights over the celestial land or maybe the celestial resources. Similarly, in the civil law system, even though the method of allocation of the property rights is different from the common law system, then an individual need to go and occupy a particular area or maybe a property which is terra nullius, which does not belong to anyone. And once they go on developing, actually making some kind of a development with the labor, then the concerned country would grant the property right to an individual on the basis of the labor, whatever has been put in. So there is a possibility of actually property independent of the state right in the civil law countries. However, for that also to conceptualize, there is a requirement of declaring the celestial bodies or maybe outer space as terra nullius, which we did not do it. We have gone by the principle of actually the res communis and a variant of a res communis with the province of all mankind and benefit and interest principle, etc. So that's why historically we have gone for actually the common rights regime, and given that particular factor, we cannot actually allow even a civil law citizen to go and actually occupy a property and get some kind of a property rights over the celestial bodies or the resources. That's one of the issues. Another argument which has been made is that the Outer Space Treaty is confined only with respect to land territory, or maybe actually the absence of sovereignty in the outer space, national non-appropriation by means of sovereignty. That is what is basically they were basically focusing upon. And Outer Space Treaty does not actually cover the resource exploitation, has been one of the arguments which I have heard quite often, which again is a fallacy to my understanding, because Article 2 not just mentions about national non-appropriation by means of sovereignty, it also speaks about by way of use or occupation or by any other means. So the wordings are very clear. So you cannot go for the national appropriation by way of use or occupation or by any other means. So all of them are very categorically mentioned therein. So what comes within the ambit of use or occupation or by any other means, if at all actually it is confined only to the sovereignty, that is really, really debatable. So resource exploitation would also come within the ambit of Article 2. But I'm not saying that by virtue of this, there is a moratorium on the exploitation of the resources. I'm not advocating for that. I'm also not saying that actually the states cannot exploit the resources. That's not my proposition at all. What I'm saying is that there cannot be an appropriation individually by the states or maybe individually by a particular private. Because it's against the principle of equity, it's also against the fundamental tenet of the common rights principle, which we have already agreed for. On the principle of equity, you can also find a lot of debate which has already happened in the UN General Assembly. There are many circumstances wherein that widening of the gap between the rich and the poor has been debated, especially in the context of space economy. One of the classic examples I can quote is the 2014 session of the UN General Assembly. If I'm not mistaken, the 69th session, wherein basically the United Nations General Assembly has gone in detail with respect to this particular issue. So my concern is that this mining should not result in terms of actually catering to the interest of select few and then ultimately widening the gap between the rich and the poor. So that's why we have to ensure that even if we make a kind of a mining gateway, this should be actually on the basis of the principle of equity and the good conscience. Next, would this be actually a tourist gateway? Of course, fascination, which we have all seen from 2021 onwards, the private players actually stepping into the space tourism. Maybe that the next destination is the celestial bodies, maybe the tourism to the moon. Of course, Mars One planned it earlier, become bankrupt actually over the period of the time. So there are actually the instances wherein we have already advertised for the tourism to the celestial bodies. Again, a caution with respect to the tourism, both Article 9 and the issue of space traffic management. Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty categorically mentions about carrying on the activities in such a way that there would not be any harmful contamination of the outer space and celestial bodies. Because if there is any such kind of a contamination, our future missions to the space and the celestial bodies itself would be at danger. We're already facing the problem in terms of the space debris. We're already facing the problems in terms of chemical effluents and even to a greater extent the radiological contamination. So if this spreads further into the celestial bodies, there will be greater problems in terms of our future missions. We have to be really careful about that. And Article 9 also has another part. If you look into the last part of the Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty, it says that any activities in outer space should not harmfully interfere with others' activities. So an activity carried on by actually one entity or maybe by one state should not result in an harmful interference with others' activities. Frequent space tourism activities, that too a kind of a pleasure trip. Definitely you can't qualify it within the ambit of the benefit and interest of all countries, Article 1, which I just highlighted before. These pleasure trips frequently, if it is basically being carried on, of course, it might be a great boon to the economy. It might also be actually the fetching a lot of profits to the private companies who are in actually the space tourism. But it is going to create a lot of chaos in the outer space in terms of the space traffic management. Already the outer space is filled with the debris. I think the NASA's picture itself, if you can go to the NASA's website, it clearly indicates the scary picture of the low Earth and the medium Earth orbit. And if we add on the missions like the space tourism missions quite frequently, then that would be a greater concern in terms of the space traffic, the management itself. So that is the reason why we need to be really careful in terms of actually making it as a tourist gateway. Next, the question of registration. I mentioned about the Registration Convention 1975, which basically speaks about the double registration. There is a registration at the national level, which the UN Secretary General actually maintains. This registration process is primarily for the purpose of having transparency and also to get to know about actually whose objects are in particular, which orbit or maybe which celestial body, etc., etc. There are a lot of consequences of the registration as well. Let me not actually delve into that in this presentation. Let me keep it for some other day when I have a topic on that. Now, what I'm trying to tell you here is that under the registration convention, registering the gateway would pose certain problems. Under Article 2 of the Registration Convention, it clearly mentions that a launching state is supposed to register the space object when a space object is launched into the Earth orbit or beyond. Soon after the space object is launched into the Earth orbit or beyond, there is a requirement of the registration of the space object by the launching state. Here, it is a partnership model in the gateway. So multiple states are involved. Not just that, even the private players are also involved, like the SpaceX is involved in this project. Who is going to register? Is it that one of them who is going to register this entire gateway? Or are they going to follow the ISS model, International Space Station, the model? If we look into each of the modules which have been actually sponsored by a particular state has gone for the registration. So that's how actually there are different states who have registered the different modules of the International Space Station. Are we going to follow the same model for the gateway? That's one of the debatable issues, and whether the states are agreeable to go for that, that becomes a crucial question with respect to the registration. More than that, suppose if there is any kind of a launch from the gateway, because in the course of time, there might also be actually a launch pad, launch facility, which might also be actually built in the gateway. And there is also plan for actually the building actually the similar type of the launch pad on the moon or maybe the celestial bodies. In that circumstance also, a launch from maybe gateway or from any celestial body would also pose some kind of a question about the registration under Article 2 of the Registration Convention. Why am I saying that might be a problem? I'm saying this because Article 2 says that the launching state has to register when a space object is launched into the Earth orbit or beyond. It is a preposition into, which creates some kind of a concern in terms of the registration. Of course, scholars have already debated on that earlier. because we use the term into only when something moves towards something else, Maybe someone has, say, stepped into the elevator. So there are two things. Elevator is one thing, a person who has stepped into is the other person. So that these are the two distinct things which we maintain when we use the preposition into. Here, we can find that in one part after the preposition, Earth orbit and beyond, both of them are covered within the ambit of one part. So what is covered in the other part should be something distinct from Earth orbit or beyond, which means only the Earth or maybe the airspace, Earth or the airspace, not from anywhere else. So that's one of the arguments which has been put forward by many critics of Article 2 of the Registration Convention. Of course, that problem might conceptualize once we have a launch from maybe the gateway or maybe from actually any of the celestial bodies. So these are certain concerns which may have to be addressed in terms of the registration of the gateway and also registration of launch from the gateway. Let me come to my last point. That's about the jurisdiction. If we look into Article 8 of the Outer Space Treaty, because jurisdiction is very important in terms of actually dealing with any issue, any kind of a tort or any kind of a crime, whatever is going to be committed in the gateway. And even, for example, the inventions. Since gateway also has got actually the research part, it's planned to have a research part. Suppose if an earthly invention has been infringed in the outer space or maybe in the gateway, how exactly we are going to exercise the jurisdiction over those kind of infringement? All those questions would also crop up. If we look into Article 8 of the Outer Space Treaty, it categorically mentions that the state of registry shall retain the jurisdiction and control over the space objects and the personnel thereof. The wordings are shall retain the jurisdiction and control over the space objects and the personnel thereof. It is not mentioning that the state of registry has the jurisdiction and control over the space objects and personnel thereof. Why am I making this distinction? I'm making this distinction to make it clear to all of you that it is not just a right, but also an obligation under Article 8 of the Outer Space Treaty. It's an obligation to retain the jurisdiction and the control over the space objects and the personnel thereof. That is number one. Number two, if we carefully look into Article 8, Article 8 combines two types of jurisdiction. It says jurisdiction over the space object, that is the quasi-territorial jurisdiction. It's a kind of a jurisdiction over an object which belongs to a particular state, right? Though not territorial, at least the quasi-territorial jurisdiction. Then it also goes on to say that the personnel thereof, it is not mentioning personnel thereon, not just those people who are on board the space object, but even those who have moved out of the space object. After entering into the outer space, they might be doing the spacewalk, or maybe on a celestial body, they might have landed. Even in those circumstances, those personnel are subject to the jurisdiction of state of registration of the space object. So it's a combination of quasi-territorial and the personal jurisdiction. Interestingly, Article 8 does not create any hierarchy between the two. There is no hierarchy between the quasi-territorial and the personal jurisdiction. It straight away says that state of registry shall retain the jurisdiction and the jurisdiction over the space object and the personnel thereof. This would definitely create problem whenever a particular space object from a country docks in the gateway, right? Suppose if maybe, let me take an example of my own country, India. Suppose if an Indian astronaut docks into actually the gateway and then subsequently enters into the module of the gateway, hypothetically the module which has been registered in the United States, hypothetically, suppose if that particular module is registered in the United States, after entering, if the astronaut is going to do something therein, a particular wrong he is committing, a tort which he is committing, or if he is infringing an invention which has been patented in the Earth, then the question arises, who will be exercising the jurisdiction? Is it going to be India or is it going to be the United States? There is every possibility of both claiming the jurisdiction. Because India, on the basis of the personal jurisdiction, it can claim jurisdiction because he is a person, an astronaut who has been actually launched from the Indian space object. So the personal jurisdiction extends even when the person is not in the Indian space object, has moved out of the space object as well. So India can claim it on the basis of the personal jurisdiction. Similarly, United States can claim jurisdiction over this particular activity because of the quasi-territorial jurisdiction. The module belongs to the United States, wherein the wrong has been committed, or maybe the IP violation has taken place. So consequently, US might also claim the jurisdiction. So this would be a situation of a conflicting jurisdiction, or alternatively, there might also be a possibility that the both states might point towards each other, one asking that you exercise the jurisdiction on the basis of personal jurisdiction, other one saying that actually you exercise the jurisdiction on the basis of a quasi-territorial jurisdiction. So such a kind of a deadlock might also arise out of actually the jurisdictional conflicts. So this is something which has to be taken care of, because Article 8 has to be read also as a kind of an obligation. And if you say it is an obligation, both the states might try to exercise the jurisdiction, resulting in a conflict between the two. So that's why I think these are some of the inconsistencies which we are having in the space treaties when we look from the perspective of the gateway. But I'm not saying that actually the gateway should not be proceeded forward. There should be a complete ban on the commercial activities. No, I'm not that kind of a radical advocate. Rather, I'm saying that actually there is a requirement of actually bringing all these things in consensus with the space treaties. But at the same point in time, if there is any difficulty under the space treaties, that need to be corrected for the purpose of adjusting the modern day activities. So these are the few points which I wanted to share with all of you. And I would be really happy to answer any other question if you have with respect to my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sandeepa, for an interesting presentation. We're going to have questions at the end, if that's okay with you. Now we're going to pass the floor to William Stewart from the Department of Geography of the University College London. Go ahead, William. You are muted.
Yeah, thanks. I'm trying to share my screen here. Let's see. Let me try this again. Okay. Thank you for that really interesting presentation. Let me get to my first, not last slide. I don't want to ruin the surprise. Yeah, thank you, Sandeep. That was really, really interesting. And I'm glad that you've used the example of docking as a jurisdiction element to the kind of outer space law, which is going to really, I think, lead to some productive discussion later on. But yeah, so thank you. I finally have gotten this working. Let's see, let's make this full screen. Cool. So hello, and thanks for coming to our session on space diplomacy. Yeah, and thanks for that like really great introduction to kind of the important issues of space law. Especially at the kind of international level. I think that's, you know, stuff that's really, it needs urgent, you know, and continued attention. Jurisdiction is really like fascinating aspect of outer space diplomacy, and it's really becoming this increasingly more complex thing as we venture out into the cosmos. You know, I'm really happy again that you used that example of docking, because that's what I'm going to be talking to you. Oh, this is the wrong presentation. I have presented quite a few things the last month, and you are getting something that's fun but different. Let me try this again. I would love to give you that presentation. It is an interesting one, but it is not what you came here for. So let's try this again. I think that you would like to hear about docking, so let's do that. Apologies for that. Here we go. Cool. Let's talk about the thing we're here to talk about, more than human space diplomacy. I'm a doctoral researcher at University College London, and I was really excited to be invited to talk about this paper. I have a slightly more unusual approach. Normally, though, it is an approach that I start with the right thing, not the wrong thing. But this kind of leads to an interesting conversation that we'll have later about interoperability. It's a process and an aim rather than a endpoint, which, you know, often interoperability fails. And we just saw that in me trying to use PowerPoint. So, yeah, the International Space Station, it is my case study here, but really it's this wider story about docking, it's this wider story about diplomacy. But first I want to kind of talk about the structure of this talk. So I'm going to introduce the objectives of the paper, the theoretical framework, and the methods, and the kind of like brief historical background. Then I'm going to talk about International Space Station diplomacy, specifically materiality and interoperability. Which again is a process and a name, not something that you just start with off the bat. And then also the future of orbital rendezvous and more than human space diplomacy, and talk about a couple kind of conclusions that I had. So next, I want to kind of talk about the aim of this paper, which was to conceptualize space diplomacy through the framework of more than human space diplomacy. I want to trace the forces that shape cooperation and collaboration in orbit. Then I will focus on the materials and interoperability of androgynous orbital docking technology. It's a kind of technology that I really became fascinated by as I was looking into the International Space Station, and the enmeshing of the US and Russia and the diplomatic assemblage of the International Space Station. And then finally, I'm going to examine how the normalization of peace in space can be replicated, perhaps terrestrially, perhaps on orbit, perhaps further abroad, by signaling alternative and additional focuses, or foci, around which cooperation can cohere and develop. So a few terms: more than human space diplomacy. More than human space diplomacy here kind of means not just the human aspect, but the kind of materials around which diplomacy can cohere. So the mutually constituted through interactions between materials, diplomacy, and state actors, such as national space programs. That's really the kind of main focus we're going to have here. This is not meant to discount human agency. It's not meant to kind of supersede or say that humans don't matter. It's a supplement to conventional approaches that, identify avenues of cooperation when perhaps terrestrial tensions prevent overt peaceful diplomacy from occurring. And then the ISS is a diplomatic assemblage. It really just is talking about the ways that the ISS doesn't exist just as this kind of purely material thing. It doesn't exist only in orbit. It exists as a series of kind of relations. It exists as several, from the ground control to the astronauts to the United Nations to international agreements and all different kinds of things that really make up what the IS is and all of the effects that it has and affects that it has throughout, I guess, Earth, throughout orbit, throughout time. And it doesn't fall just under the jurisdiction or control of any single state, but it's a relational field. It's produced by a range of state actors and the legal instruments that they produce, and therefore it can be understood as this diplomatic entity. So a brief history. The International Space Station, doesn't just come out of nowhere. It comes from this series of things that have a long history and an important history, and it kind of starts at the very beginning of the space age, really. And I'm talking about orbital docking, and I think this is the kind of most important thing that allows space to happen. I mean, you have to be able to link things in orbit in order to have more than just one thing. And so, I want to start with this kind of particular maneuver that is orbital docking. So in 1966, the US Gemini spacecraft attempted to dock on orbit with an uncrewed Agena target vehicle. Now, prior to this, there was another attempt, but which failed. And that was really crucial to the actual success of orbital docking, because prior to this, astronauts, NASA, they knew how to dock in orbit. They knew how to connect these two things mathematically, but they didn't know how to do it in practice. And so, they try to link these two things. And there's this really interesting story about how, you can do it, on paper, but then when you actually try to link in orbit, as you go faster, you change orbit so that you try to reach this thing and you keep getting further and further away, or you slow down and you kind of get further and further away. So you have to do, you had to do that in practice rather than just kind of do it mathematically. But the first successful orbital docking happens on 16 March 1966, and it involves a non-androgynous probe and drogue method with an active male probe and a passive female drogue. And this is going to become important as I go on. And these are just some images that I find really, really interesting. I mean, the imagery of space, I think, does something really important to allow us to visualize and feel a sense of belonging to this endeavor. I mean, this is a very much two superpower project, but there are so many more players that I think are really important. But, this imagery, I think, just allows us to kind of see how vast space is and how kind of difficult it can be. So moving on to the Apollo-Soyuz test project, 1975, after Apollo in the moon landing, there's not a lot that is exciting about outer space, at least for the Americans. The Russians or the Soviets at this time have a pretty robust orbital space station. They have a good program going on that's quite successful, and the United States isn't really doing much. And so this is a mission that essentially is the United States doing something. And Apollo, they're basically just continuing this and waiting for this space shuttle to become developed. And so during this period of détente, the United States and the Soviet Union decided to do this handshake in space. Well, in order to dock in orbit, the two spacecraft couldn't really talk to each other. They had different atmospheres in their spacecraft. And so if without some kind of docking adapter, if they linked up together, the astronauts and the cosmonauts would die because of the change in pressure. So they had to develop an androgynous docking method that allowed these two incompatible spacecraft to dock on equal terms. And this is important because in the last slide, I talked about the male probe and the female drogue. And at this time, and I would imagine this probably still continues today, the idea of, two superpowers not both being masculine is a really important message here. So they had to figure out a way for both parties to be seen as masculine and neither subservient. But this mission saw these two Cold War adversaries work closely and collaboratively to perform this first multinational orbital docking. And so what happens is the collaboration that happens here that's for developing this technology becomes foundational for the construction of the International Space Station. As Leonid Brezhnev says, one can say that the Soyuz Apollo, again, the privileging of Soyuz over Apollo, and as an American saying Apollo Soyuz first, there's always these power dynamics. But he's saying that this is a forerunner of future international orbital stations. And it is. I argue that it very much is. And this leads us to the kind of post-Cold War era, where the United States and now Russia learn to cooperate even more closely. So NASA and the Russian Space Agency signed an agreement for closer cooperation in orbit. This docking technology allows greater interoperability to facilitate a wider array of partners and configurations for what will become the space station assemblage. But at the heart of this Shuttle Mir project actually is the docking technology developed during Apollo-Soyuz. And so what we're starting to see is this lineage of diplomacy, this lineage of interoperability, this lineage of cooperation and collaboration between, what was and kind of still is two acrimonious partners. And this is a really, really important way to understand how material diplomacy becomes, a useful lens through which to start analyzing and thinking about, diplomacy. And so, this sets the stage for, and it's literally called phase one of the space station. This sets the stage for what, is to become the International Space Station. And this has a legacy related to the APAS, Androgynous Peripheral Attach System, that was developed for Apollo-Soyuz. And then it's connected to Mir, that was this, really, if you're not familiar, it's this really successful, but not unproblematic space station. It did catch fire at one point, which is a lesson learned for future space stations like the International Space Station and perhaps Gateway. So in 1998, the International Space Station Agreement was signed, and it brought together space station partners, and it sets the terms for collaboration on the ISS, its construction, management, and operation. So at the heart of this project is the APAS 95 that's developed for Shuttle Mir, and it's also later used on the ISS. And one of these modules connects the Russian Zarya module. One of these docking mechanisms connect the Russian Zarya module to the US Unity module. And I think that it's just really telling that this piece of technology developed during the Cold War that has this kind of what is now becoming a long history is at the literal heart of the space station. And so, I think this is just really telling how we can start to see a slightly different history, a slightly different telling of this story that can be understood as quite problematic. I mean, while I'm talking about this cooperation, it seems quite positive. I mean, I have to acknowledge that there is a lot of, essentially all of this technology kind of built on the back of the military-industrial complex that has a history related to like V-2 rockets developed during World War II. And so it's not an unproblematic history, but it still is a retelling of a story that we can take these lessons into a future that can possibly be maybe more cooperative than combative. And so, moving on, what's now the interoperability of the space station and the docking mechanisms. This is a really important aspect because I think that, as you see here, this is the International Docking System Standard. You can go on the website, you can essentially get all the technical specifications for how to develop docking technology so that you could potentially have a company that links up with, the International Space Station and other spacecraft. And it's just out there for anybody to use. And this is really important because, as you see here with the homepage, says that, these standards are being developed so that there is international cooperative missions and also crew rescue. This is, something that when you're in an extreme environment like outer space, you really need to make sure that you can send a spacecraft up and actually dock. You can't just kind of appear and have somebody leave one of the airlocks and approach another spacecraft. You have to be able to talk to each other on orbit. The extreme environment, I think, is something that really makes outer space quite a bit different than any other place. But, at the heart of this International Docking System Standard is the legacy of the, APAS, the legacy of this docking mechanism. It says here in this image capture from the document for the International Docking System, it says to account for this legacy. And you can see where, APAS is listed. And I think that that's just, it's just so telling that still to this day, we're talking about this docking mechanism. And it also is used on the Chinese space station. They have adopted these same standards. And I think that's really, really important to tell us that, we can focus on perhaps some technical standards, some materials that allow for cooperation where otherwise cooperation wouldn't happen between partners who cooperation isn't happening. So, back to interoperability now. Interoperability going forward is one of the kind of goals that a lot of these different space agencies have. Again, it's a process. Sometimes you pull up the wrong slides and you don't have interoperability for the moment, but eventually you figure it out. And so, this again is a kind of aspirational thing. If you go to the website, it's not really fully fleshed out, but it is something that is the kind of aspirational. So that's really what and I think is important about the outer space project is it's very aspirational. I think that in the previous slides that I didn't get to talk about, but I would love for you all to come here someday, there is this sense of belonging that I think outer space has, that if we can get over some of these terrestrial conflicts, some of these power dynamics that are at play in like international law and this superseding of international law, which I'll talk about in a second, we can perhaps envision a future in outer space as somewhat more collaborative, cooperative, and doesn't reinforce these like kind of terrestrial power dynamics that we kind of have today. But even I talked about Apollo-Soyuz and Soyuz-Apollo on the International Deep Space Interoperability Standards website. Here you have NASA first and Russia second, and you very much see these symbolic representations of power at play constantly. And I think that's something that we should be aware of, and hopefully we can kind of overcome some of these terrestrial political squabbles. So this brings me to Artemis. We were talking about the United Nations and the Outer Space Treaty. Some would argue that the Artemis Accords is the United States' attempt to kind of overcome or supersede some of these international legal instruments. And so, I think that Artemis is really important to talk about now, because interoperability is a key principle of the Artemis Accords. But it's important to remember whose standards are adopted. The United States is kind of, pushing for this interoperability as a means of kind of fostering cooperation. But whose standards are adopted is always going to be, at the forefront of any partner's minds. You're not going to want to adopt the standards of interoperability that just continue to privilege certain partners over others. If you're signing on to these accords, you ideally would have equal partnership, but which has been through the history of NASA particularly, not particularly something that it's done well. That's one of the reasons why the International Space Station becomes international versus just space station freedom. It was as it was originally posited, because NASA didn't want to give up control, and as a result, it didn't really go anywhere. It wasn't until the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia was able to be brought on as a partner that this project actually, develops into something that we see today in the International Space Station. So the Artemis Accords really recently, between now and when I kind of developed these slides and presented them earlier in the summer, the Artemis Accords changed just recently. And so, there's an eclectic mix of signatories here, but there was, and I'm keeping this up for a reason, a notable omission. This graphic doesn't have Germany on it. Now it has Germany, and Germany wasn't a signatory because its view was that the United States was trying to supersede the Outer Space Treaty with the Artemis Accords. And they just, maybe like 2 or 3 days ago, signed on to the Artemis Accords. And that's just a really interesting development. What does it mean for the Outer Space Treaty? I don't know. Sandeepa might have something interesting to say about that. And, but India is a part of the Artemis Accord, so I really am looking forward to a conversation about this. So what's next? More than human space diplomacy, there are really important developments in space right now. China has a fully kind of independent space station. India recently landed a rover on the lunar surface. And, these are 2 space programs that are developing rapidly and are really important to kind of keep in mind as we think about, what's next in the space age. But also, the dynamic between the United States and Russia is becoming increasingly troubled, I would say. So in my paper, I talk a little bit about this moment where Russia, just after the invasion of Ukraine, threatens to deorbit the International Space Station, because the United States, in bringing Russia on and kind of in the spirit of cooperation, didn't have, and still doesn't have, a means of keeping the orbit of the International Space Station up. Russia's Soyuz rockets and I think Progress are the only two kind of things that keep the ISS in orbit. Otherwise, eventually the very little but enough drag that is enacted on the ISS means that it can be deorbited. And so without Russia's help, the ISS actually can't remain in orbit. And so I think that's, a really important thing that, we should keep in mind. So to kind of wrap up, I just want to say that I think that this avenue of diplomacy, while it's not something that, is meant to discount human agency, it's not meant to discount these traditional ways of conducting diplomacy, they're still really important. Like thinking about the materials around which diplomacy emerges can be a productive way of finding new ways to overcome terrestrial disagreements. And with that, I will stop talking, but please do feel free to reach out if you'd like to see the other presentation that I think is also really interesting. I would love to talk more about that as well. And thank you. Yeah.
Thank you for that presentation, William Stewart. We have a lot of questions in the WUVA platform. There are some that you already answered, William, but I don't know if you want to share it. For example, the ones by Jean Corpus. How can space diplomacy contribute to addressing global challenges such as climate change monitoring, disaster management, and bridging the digital divide? What are the potential benefits of international cooperation in these areas? You already answered, but maybe you can share it with the audience.
Yeah, so let's see here. Really, my argument here is that by focusing on these different materials, that we can find some common ground where we otherwise don't. Climate change is going to be an interesting one, right? Because I think, as I allude to in my answer online, that increasingly climate change is becoming important it's always been important, right? But increasingly we're becoming more and more acutely aware of the changes in the environment that are global problems, right? So we think about something like the International Space Station. It's really multinational. It's not international. It's a kind of, it's named aspirationally maybe, but it's a multinational thing. But internationally, we really, in order to kind of combat something that's international, we have to work internationally and cooperatively. And so thinking about the technical challenges that maybe we can focus on can allow some of the political challenges to be set aside. And so, I think this is the potential benefit, is that we can perhaps not, perhaps set aside those differences. Sandeepa might have a different answer or, something to add, and I'd love to hear what he has to say.
Yeah, I completely agree with your answer actually, but if we have to go through the treaties, since I'm a lawyer, probably I will be banking on the treaties more. Article 1 itself, I have already highlighted that actually all activities are to be carried on in the benefit and interest of all the countries. And for carrying it forward, there is a declaration in 1996 in the UN General Assembly actually to carry forward or practically benefit and interest principle. A declaration has also been entered in 1996, which even the United States has actually agreed for during that time. So carrying forward from there, there is definitely a possibility of the cooperation and maybe disaster management or maybe early warning system, all those different things. Of course, one of the examples which I can quote is the SARC website. SARC website is, the SARC satellite. The SARC satellite is primarily for the purpose of doing this and helping out our Indian neighbors for the purpose of actually ensuring that the disaster management issues are actually covered, and even actually assistance in terms of disaster is also basically made under that. So yeah, possibly that has to be done in a larger scale because the environment is a concern for everyone. It is not just for actually few countries.
Do you want me to read the other questions, or do you want to comment on each other's.
I haven't registered in Nova, so sorry. So that's why I can't see the questions actually there.
Yeah, if you just want to read another question, be fun.
Okay, I'll go ahead and do that. Next question. How has space diplomacy evolved over time? What are some historical examples of successful space diplomacy initiatives and agreements? So it's like a broad question to give
I
us
have to answer it,
perspective.
probably. If I have to take on that, ISS, as William has rightly pointed out, is the classic example of that. How can actually the two adversaries of the Cold War era can come together for such a kind of a mega project? Of course, of late in the Russia-Ukraine war, Russia has pulled out is a different issue. But before that, it's a success model to my understanding in terms of the space diplomacy. William, please.
Yeah, quickly, I in my kind of moment of being flustered, pulling up the wrong presentation, I didn't address the kind of from the very moment of the space age, discounting the the historic evolution based on the V2 and its role in a lot of death, but like from the moment of the Sputnik moment, let's call that the first moment of the space age for the sake of this conversation, that cooperation and interoperability is built into this endeavor. So when Sputnik is launched, and before it's launched, there's discussions about how the signal that's broadcast from Sputnik is going to be shared globally. And so a lot of different countries across the globe, Iran, South Africa, United States, these are the ones that I can remember off the top of my head, but I mean, it's anybody could access the frequencies that Sputnik was operating on. It's this kind of surprisingly cooperative endeavor. It was done as a part of the International Geophysical Year of like 1957, and it kind of highlights the role of cooperating on these technical projects that, I mean, it continues. Like, that's kind of what I'm presenting on, is how this cooperation continues. I mean, that's a very aspirational, it's a very like almost naive way of looking at space cooperation and diplomacy. I mean, of course there's problems. Of course, like I said, the space project is also built on the kind of military spending and violence, but also it's kind of how we use technology that matters. And if we think about it in this way, that we can cooperate on another space station, if we can bring international partners like India into future space diplomacy, it's going to be really important. I mean, it becomes more complex as we see that, there is an international agreement that the United States is maybe trying to challenge with Artemis Accords versus the Outer Space Treaty. I mean, these are complex conversations, but I really think that there's these moments, especially of material diplomacy, to talk about my own research again, but like this material diplomacy that can be really fruitful for discussions of cooperation. Yeah, I don't know if that's like the perfect answer there, but it's I think it's still important to kind of keep in mind.
And in that sense, do you think that space diplomacy, any of you, space diplomacy can contribute to maintaining peaceful relations or preventing conflicts and promoting global security in the context of space activities? One of the keynote speakers was talking about maybe the idea of not having limited resources can produce less conflict. No, for example, I think that could go in that line. What do you think?
I mean, I can jump in here real quick. Yeah, I mean, that's like a really nice notion, right? But like, we take, and I hate to say this because like this goes against kind of what I'm trying to argue, but we take our terrestrial notions with us when we go to outer space, right? So we take the notion of colonialism with us when we talk, even just talking about Mars. People talk about Mars colonization. If we take that with us, there's still going to be, the negative repercussions that come along with that. And if you talk about space mining, like, oh, unlimited resources, that also, on the other hand, is the potential for unlimited space debris that could destroy the planet. Do we really want to do that? I don't think so. And people don't really, I mean, it seems nice. Like, yeah, unlimited resources would be great. Well, if you start mining out there, you cause debris. That debris can cause, the Kessler syndrome to occur. And, that's something we really don't want. If you don't know what the Kessler syndrome is, it's sort of the catastrophic cascading deorbiting of like satellites as a result of debris.
Yes, maybe just to supplement actually. So in terms of the resources, even if we actually bring it back from the celestial bodies, it is going to select it is going to actually serve the interest of only select few. It's not going to be actually shared with the developing countries or the less developed countries. And that is the greater concern which we are having. So resources might come, but at the same point of time, actually the select few big multinational corporations might profit out of that. And this is the very problem which I tried to address very briefly in my presentation. The gap between the rich and the poor, the divide is increasing. And that is not just in the space economy. We have actually debated that in multiple other sectors as well. But in space economy, since it's huge, there is every possibility of widening this gap leaps and bounds. So that's why I don't think actually for dealing with our current crisis, space economy is an answer for that actually.
And for example, to not be idealistic, as William Stewart said, what are some examples, specific examples of joint space missions, data sharing initiatives, and collaborative research projects? Asks Jan Corpus Valencia as well.
I mean, CERN is a big one. It's like that, the Large Hadron Collider. I mean, honestly, there's actually quite a lot. I mean, whether it's from like kind of data sharing for even just like the international some Union of Concerned Scientists, they like share their data about how many orbital like debris objects are in orbit, or all kinds of United Nations things. There is quite a lot, but I really I had to like look to the Artemis Accords thing too closely, but I saw India, and we're talking, I think India's represents like a kind of really interesting player in outer space right now. And I was thinking about this the other day. I'm most looking forward to see what happens when India kind of finds out what who its partners are going to be in the kind of future of space technical objects, I guess, like large technical objects like the ISS or Gateway. I'm really excited to see what happens, because I think that there's a lot that India is doing right now that they're obviously doing really well. And I think they represent like what is going to be an exciting direction. I mean, Sandeepa, you can probably elaborate on that.
Oh, yeah. Maybe in terms of actually the coordination, I can quote the IADC debris mitigation, actually the committee, because IADC is working quite well in terms of actually the international awareness, and even in terms of actually mapping of the debris and then sharing the information with respect to the debris. So that's one of the classic examples which I can say. But apart from that, actually, even between the states, there are actually the collaborations, but information is not available in the public domain. For example, even in the ISRO, Indian Space Research Organization, we have got actually a lot of tie-up with the United States, as well as actually the tie-ups with the JAXA, Japanese Space Agency. So, but only problem is that actually it is not kept in the public domain. And in many circumstances, when India is launching actually the space objects, we also launch actually the space objects of multiple other countries. There are instances of 109 satellites being launched at one go by India, all of them belonging to the different countries. So that can happen only by virtue of the collaboration and cooperation between the countries. So yeah, but IADC is one of the classic examples, because maybe in terms of debris mitigation, so all of us are working together in an international level itself. Yeah, even for Chandrayaan, actually, there is a lot of support from other agencies as well. It is not that actually it is only an accomplishment of India. Chandrayaan 1, to be very precise, at that time, even a US component was there in Chandrayaan 1. In Chandrayaan 3, there was no separate component, but the support has been made by other countries as well with respect to it. And with respect to the Artemis Accords, actually, I think probably there was a discussion previously about it. Have a bit of a reservation, definitely. And one of my blog pieces, I've shared it actually in the chat box. I don't know whether it is reachable to the participants. It should be only to the hosts and that panelists, I suppose. But I have shared that. If maybe the hosts can basically share it with the participants, that would be great. There are a few concerns about the Artemis Accords, India signing it. I don't really appreciate it, but at the same point in time, there is a possibility of India doing something within the Artemis Accord, since we have already become part of that. I have tried to analyze that in that particular very short piece of maybe 1,500, 1,600 words. That's it. But it's a very short summary, and a detailed article is going to come up in the course of time on the same issue. Maybe let me also address a question in the chat box, question and answer here. I think there is one question about astronauts are considered to the embassies of the humanity when in space. Do or will space tourists receive the same accommodation? If we look into the Moon Agreement, Article 10 basically speaks about considering any person on the Moon or other celestial bodies to be an astronaut under the Outer Space Treaty or a personnel under the Rescue Agreement. But can we import that to the Outer Space Treaty and the Rescue Agreement is a debatable the issue, because Moon Agreement is a letter agreement, number one. Number two, it has also been signed and ratified by a very, very limited number of states, as I've already pointed out. So it has got a very limited ratification. So importing that while interpreting Outer Space Treaty and the Rescue Agreement would be really, really problematic, and probably we might not be able to do that. And if you interpret Outer Space Treaty Article 5 and the Rescue Agreement in its true sense as it has been actually drafted, I don't think the tourists should be enjoying any privilege of the astronaut, because astronauts enjoy that privilege of the emergency assistance since they are considered to be the envoys of the mankind. They're doing something for the benefit of the mankind as a whole. That is the reason why that protection has been granted. And if you look into the Rescue Agreement, it doesn't even tell about the cost reimbursement. If the astronauts are going to be actually rescued and returned back, there is no provision with respect to the cost reimbursement. Provision is only with respect to the return of the space object. When you return the space object, there is a provision for the cost reimbursement, because it is not an envoy of the mankind. Astronaut is. So similarly, space tourists cannot be considered to be an envoy of the mankind, since they are not doing anything for the benefit of the mankind as a whole. So that's the point in terms of actually the space tourists. I think there is one more question that's about what do you see for the future when the agreements are made at one point in time that is impacted a year or so later, because the focus of a member country changes significantly. Okay, so if you look into the VCLT, Vienna Convention on the Law of the Treaties, it specifically says that if there is a change in the state practice over the period of time, then you may have to consider interpreting the treaty provision. Article 31 of the VCLT basically mentions about it. But we have to be really careful. It cannot happen with one or two states in the particular treaty. It has to happen commonly with the multiple states for the purpose of making such a kind of a change in the interpretation of a treaty provision. So here, I don't think actually the majority of the parties to the Outer Space Treaty have found that kind of a difficulty or have changed their actually the state practice. So given that particular factor, you cannot actually allow maybe United States or any other country unilaterally to change the treaty interpretation. That's what actually, in fact, William basically mentioned about the German the stand. Professor Stefan Hobe from Cologne University was vehemently opposing the Artemis Accord over the period of the time. He was holding back actually the German signing of the Artemis Accords for a long period of time. What happened, I don't know. At the same point in time, I was holding India back from actually doing that. Unfortunately, I was not successful of late. That's what I should say. Right.
I was also going to really quickly mention how Saskia Vermeulen in the panel going on, kind of like the other room right now, she turned me on to the fact she's also a kind of space law person and an artist. Interesting combination. She turned me on to the fact that in these, like a moon mission, let's say, a mission to the moon where SpaceX is providing services, they have provisions in their kind of terms and agreements that where California state law doesn't cover something, like the law is going to be essentially like corporate law, like their corporation, SpaceX law. And that's something that's not talked about very often. Like what jurisdiction is going to happen when like there are, let's say, a base on the moon or a base on Mars? What law is going to work there, especially when it's not just national entities, responsible for these things, but also commercial ones. And I think that's a really important thing that we should be thinking about.
Yes, absolutely. And if you look into the Outer Space Treaty, again, there is a provision for that. Even though Outer Space Treaty does not specifically mention about regulating the private space activities, Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty attributes responsibility for every activity, whether it is by the governmental entities or by the non-governmental entities. So, and it also mentions the appropriate state party should be responsible for it, actually. And they have to authorize and continuously supervise any private space activity under Article 6. Since SpaceX is going to be authorized, and I mean, of course, it is already been authorized and continuously supervised by the United States. Whether continuously or not is a different issue, but anyhow, it is supposed to do it, actually. So since it is supposed to be done under the United States the law, responsibility would be also attributed to the United States under Article 6.
Unfortunately, we ran out of time, but thank you very much for this interesting exchange. I hope the audience enjoyed it, and hope to see you next year in this conference.
Maybe we do one about belonging in space and space heritage. I have a presentation for that.
Great. Enjoy the rest of the day and the conferences.
Thank you. Wish you the same.
Thanks. Bye.